Kia ora, kia ora. Our first set focused on corruption around financial systems and the impact of transnational organised crime on Pacific people. Reducing corruption is what Transparency International and the global movement are all about. This next set of 4 sessions, running from now through to August, focus on environmental concerns. When natural resources are allocated without transparent and fair involvement of Indigenous people, women and local communities, then trust in public systems is completely eroded. Corrupt political, public sector, criminal and private practices are often the foundation for natural resource exploitation and damage. But across the Pacific, communities are confronting corruption, displacement, climate injustice, and the marginalisation of traditional governance. They are the guardians of Moana and the whenua, working at the flax roots and the power systems of action, policy and culture. We'd just like to say thank you very much to Rochelle Stewart-Allen, who's constructed these webinars and done all the hard work, and to Zenaida of For Purpose, who's managing the tech. And we can only do these forums with funding. Thank you to Transparency International, with funding provided by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Australia. I'll hand over to Fenton shortly, but just some housekeeping. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube site. Please ensure you mute your microphones. Bearing in mind, we may have variable internet connections. We may have to do things with videos, but that's just the way of it. This is an information sharing event, so we assume a range of understanding of the topic. So if there's anything you don't understand, please ask a question in the chat. Also use the chat to ask questions of our speakers. There are no dumb questions. We want to have a kororo that's useful to everyone. We're also very happy to field questions after the event. And finally, our values at TINS are integrity, courage, transparency, respect and non-partisanship. And we bring those values to this hui today. We respect different opinions. We can all learn from each other. So that's enough for me. I'm now going to hand over to Fenton. For those who haven't had the pleasure of meeting him, Fenton Lutuna Tambua is a Pacific climate advocate, storyteller and facilitator with a background in community organising and environmental justice. He has led regional campaigns amplifying Pacific voices on climate resilience and governance, and is known for creating inclusive spaces for dialogue, reflection and collective action across the region. I've very much enjoyed watching your TED Talks and learning about your leadership. So Bula Vanaka, Fenton, over to you.
That was such a beautiful welcome and an overview of what to expect today. Thank you so much, Julie. And Bulvinaka, everyone, as Julie mentioned, I'm Fenton Lutnatumbua, and I have the absolute honor of being in conversation with an incredible...
Nice glasses, Fenton.
Thank you very much. With an incredible lineup of panelists that are opening up TINZ's new Pacific Environmental Governance webinar series. We are hoping that today is more than just a webinar, but a truly Pacific-led conversation about honoring our connection to Moana and land and the wisdom we carry forward to future generations. Today's webinar, as Julie mentioned, is titled Guardians of Moana and Land, Indigenous Governance for Pacific Sustainability, a topic that is very dear to my heart, and I'm certain the heart of the panelists. Our panelists are dedicated and extremely leaderful Indigenous experts in their fields and necessary knowledge holders from our Pacific region. Today, they will share how their understanding of customary governance, cultural values, and ancestral wisdom are guiding their work and the necessary work for sustainable action across our region. Before I introduce our panelists, I would love to hear from you. The invitation here is to share with us in chat the Indigenous concept you are familiar with that guides your relationship to the environment. And also, very importantly, we would love to know which Pacific nation you are joining us from. As folks start dropping their responses in the chat, I would love to introduce the first of our 3 panelists. Alisi Rabukawaqa is an Indigenous Fijian ocean advocate and environmental communicator. She brings a strong background in marine conservation and Indigenous leadership, promoting Wakatatambu as a guiding principle. Alisi is passionate about predicting the deep connections between people, culture, and the environment across the Pacific. And today, we're hoping to hear from Alisi about her work on restoring biodiversity through Indigenous frameworks. Bula Alisi, the floor is yours.
Bulvinaka Fenton, and I hope the sound is coming through clearly for everyone. I'm in Suva. It's sunny, it's beautiful, and the street is close by. I hope the noise isn't coming across to people. First, I'd like to thank Transparency International New Zealand for this amazing opportunity. When I was asked to share a bit on this topic on Indigenous governance for Pacific sustainability, thinking about traditional Indigenous knowledge, I've spoken in a few different settings around this topic, but I always find that it's such a great opportunity to always reflect. A lot of this work, when you think about our Indigenous practices and culture, are naturally done through our work, through our engagement, through how we move in the different spaces, whether it's in our communities, in our families, or even in like workspaces. But we often don't get a chance to think about and articulate what that means and how to sort of marry the two. You know, it's like we do it in practice, but then it's also important to reflect on how important it is to bring into these spaces. Because one thing I first want to acknowledge, first want to highlight is the lack of acknowledgement of the importance of our traditional cultural practices and knowledge in how we engage and do work. For me, when I think about environmental marine conservation, you can come to Fiji, you can go across the Pacific and ask anyone who works in the same field as me. And I think they will tell you that 90% of your work really comes from doing Indigenous or enhancing Indigenous knowledge and ways of working. Yeah? And Fenton had shared that I would speak about sacredness as concept of in revitalizing Indigenous knowledge. And I wanted to speak about it through the three things that Fenton had shared in my bio: people, culture, and environment. And I hope I can do this within these 10 minutes that I have. It's such a big thing to talk about. But when we think about Indigenous practices, one of the first things we have to think about is ourselves and our identity. And in Fiji, and I'm sure in many Pacific Island countries, one of the things that we have in our identity is our totems, which is what connects us to the Waitui or Moana, Wudiwai, which is freshwater ecosystems, the kau, Veikau, or our forests, and the Maliolala, the air, which is often like birds. And right across Fiji, when you sit with people and you ask them, they can identify their totems. And you will have a totem in the ocean, a totem on land, a plant totem, a bird totem. And even in areas that are primarily highlands and freshwater, they will have freshwater totems. And it's already showing how that is Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous practice of how we have that connectivity. We already recognize that these totems represent our elders. They have been here before us. And when we identify these totems, it's that sacredness of Wakatatambu is that there is an element of stewardship we have to these totems or these things, and that they also have for us, because we recognize protecting them or holding them in sacredness is also important for us because we rely on them. And that's like the environment piece of it. And then in the social part of this environmental stewardship, I wanted to share in relation to 2 weeks back. I've had the privilege of being in a national youth council, a national conference where we had youth representatives from across all provinces in Fiji, all 14 provinces, from community, including representatives from Ramdi, Kioa, and Rotuma. They are like diaspora within Fiji, but, you know, we have a long history of migration between our countries. And one of the things that we talked about was Indigenous knowledge and climate action. And when I was in that space, something I wanted to share that we talked about was the concept of our identity. And in our identity and in the way that we move in community, there is this concept of vengaravi, which is to serve. And like much of our identity comes from having this thing of, when you think about governance, you think about leadership, but to be a leader, you have to first learn how to serve. And we have that word in our culture, vengaravi or vengaravi. And what it literally means when translated is to face each other. And I think that was one of the most important things, you know, to look at each other, to face each other, to serve each other. And then another thing we talk about is when you think of the South and the identity, what are the milestones of development within that identity? When you were born as a child, you have your vamboliva, which is this process of, for 4 days and 4 nights, a baby's head does not touch the ground. They are carried by moms, by aunties, by sisters. And this is a process of showing how much care and love goes into a child who's born into a clan, into a tribe, into a family. And then you get into this next phase of development, which is called kalinisubu, when a child is weaned off their mother, when they stop having breast milk. That's another stage of development. They're no longer feeding directly from their mom. You know, they're starting to eat food from the ground, from the sea, from the trees. They're developing into another stage of their lives. And then thinking about another milestone of development later on, which we call our vakatale tumbu. And these are puberty rights, you know, when you reach puberty. And there are rights that go for girls and for boys at this stage. For girls, you know, there's this process of mataini vambuka, or it's called the first firewood harvest. The first time that you would send a child and tell them, go and get some firewood so we can cook. It's a milestone that's celebrated to say this child is now starting to show that they have purpose. They're starting to serve, you know, vengaravi in the community. Another one, when they get older for boys, it's called kanaimbure. It's when they have their circumcision. And for girls, it's called mbutunravu, when they have their first period. And so you will continue to see that, especially in Fijian culture, there's a lot of emphasis and sacredness and importance in this first as a part of development. And then as they continue to grow, the responsibilities or their development milestones are celebrated because you are growing up, but you're also growing into becoming someone who will serve and who will become a leader later on. And that is just, for my work, I believe is just as important as understanding our totem plants, understanding the science of, and you know, this is a whole nother strand of conversation, the science of the stars, the sea, the seasons of planting, of fishing, understanding our environment, but also understanding ourselves, because they all need to be interconnected to be effective. And we often find in modern society now, there are certain parts of this that have broken off, that have been disconnected, that doesn't allow for this full realization of becoming our stewards or the guardians of our Moana and, you know, our oceans and our land. And in thinking about how do we restore these knowledge systems in this contemporary space is a big conversation, but I just wanted to highlight, I don't know how much time I have left, that it is something that within that youth space that I sat in, they asked this question and they dissected how it would practically look. And they developed action plans of, if I want to do something like this in my community, this is what it could potentially look like. In a modern age where your development milestones are your sweet 16, your 21st birthday, passing your external exams, getting a degree in university, all important things, I have to say. How do I bring in the milestone developments in my culture and tradition to be part of this and celebrate it in this way so that they are living together in harmony in being that I am, that I have to juggle. I have to think about how to continue to weave together these different parts of my identity. Yeah, that is what we had discussed. And so that I think would be like an initial presentation from me for this segment. I thank you so much for your time and listening to me. And yeah, I look forward to hearing the sharings from everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alisi. Those reflections on stewarding the sacredness and truly being the salt of this work, both preserving and enhancing Indigenous praxis in ways that call us to face each other, is both grounding and uplifting. I just want to say thank you very much for sharing that and all of those development milestones as well. I definitely have to have a conversation with you later about a couple of things, but I do want to introduce our next speaker, Professor Tarcisius Kabutaulaka. Professor Tarcisius is a Solomon Island scholar and political analyst that's based at the University of Hawaii. He specializes in Pacific Island politics, development, and Indigenous governance, and his research bridges academic insight and community knowledge with a focus on decolonization, relational leadership, and regional resilience. Today, we'll hear from Professor about customary authority and the very important intergenerational responsibility. Binaka, Professor.
Yeah, Binaka, Fenton, Bula, everybody. Now, Mama now hamu rona kita sai mana tutuhunu, dosulhana, and hello oketa, mahalo and aloha from Honolulu. I want to begin by thanking Transparency International New Zealand and the organizers for the invitation and for having me here. I'm really, really honored to have this privilege. I have a couple of things that I've been given as prompts to talk about, and they include the role of customary authority, community-based environmental governance, relationships between customary and formal systems, and to reflect on sustainability, equity, and intergenerational responsibility. And these are really huge topics that I cannot substantively discuss in the next 10 minutes, but I will do my best. In our introductory preparatory meeting, I mentioned that these are not exactly my areas of expertise. And therefore, I will speak broadly, not only on particular places, but the Pacific more generally, and hopefully that will contribute to the discussions that we will have later on. And I want to organize my presentation in 3 parts. And the first part is looking at land, ocean, and relationships. And, when we talk about systems of tenure, which is a fancy word for how societies organize themselves around land, around forests, around waters, around sea, what we are basically talking about is networks of relationships and stories, and how they are transcribed onto landscapes and onto seascapes. So we are basically talking about stories when we talk about tenure systems, and how these stories and relationships govern not only our relationships with each other, but our relationships with the environment that we live in, with the ocean, with land, with the forests, and so forth. And so what is central in this is the idea of relationship between people and relationship with the environment, between people and the environment. So consequently, when we talk about land registration, we are primarily talking about registration of stories. And if we take the case of Fiji, for instance, the process of the Veitarungi Vanua, which started around 1890s to the 1940s, that led to land registration, was mostly about the search for and the registration of stories of relationships between people and between people in particular land or places in Fiji. That, of course, those of you who know Fiji, subsequently led to the identification of particular Matangalis or relationships to Matangalis, and then the attachment of Matangalis to particular land areas, and eventually, of course, the registration of individuals into the Volani Kawambula. And we see similar processes happening elsewhere in the Pacific, particularly in the push for land registration or in the push for the identification of land groups. We've seen it in the case of Solomon Islands and Samoa, and nearly every Pacific Island country has a land registration act. And I think what is important in this is that when people have land, what is important in this is the centrality of stories in the relationships that we talk about. If you read land-related court cases, it's primarily about contest over stories. It's about competing stories and therefore, responsibilities to particular places. Some of these stories are written onto landscapes and oceanscapes through names that we have, names of places that we have. And those names not only identify places, but they also identify belongingness and responsibilities. And when you erase those names, you erase those stories, and you also erase responsibilities as well. A classic example that I want to point to is the case of Pearl Harbor here in Hawaii. So the Hawaiian name for Pearl Harbor is Pualoa, which defines relationships to that particular place, defines how it is used or how it provides for livelihood of people. Over time, what we know is that the dominant story of Pearl Harbor is about the story of US militarism. And therefore the militarization, not only of a landscape, but the militarization of a story as well. And nowadays, what we know is that that is usually packaged as a tourist product and sold in what some have referred to as militarism, the intersection between militarism and tourism. Now, I suppose some of you are probably wondering, how does this relate to customary authority? How does it relate to community-based environmental and governance? So dual systems of authority and issues of sustainability, equity, and intergenerational responsibility. How this idea of stories on land, stories on relationship relate to all these things that I've been asked to talk about. And that leads me to my second point. And in this second point, I want to assert that customary governance in the Pacific Island refers to not only organizational structures that we create in society through chiefs or through community governance, but it is also embedded in the stories and practices that govern how we relate to land and sea. And so it's not only the institutional structures that are important, but the stories are also very, very important. And if we lose those stories, then we weaken the social structures that we use to govern our relationship to land, to forest, to the ocean, to the environment around us. And for example, in some Pacific Island places, environmental conservation is often, and as our previous speaker has mentioned, environmental conservation, our attempts to address environmental issues are often connected to those stories. And those stories are connected to rituals and rites that Alisi has talked about. My colleague, Ron Vave from Fiji, his scholarship, for instance, focuses on how chiefly funerals and rituals and rites are connected to marine conservation in Fiji. And he is much more qualified to talk about this, but what he has discovered is that this is true not only for funeral rituals, but it is also true for the entire human existence from birth to death. That there are rituals that we practice that are embodied in stories, that are connected to a particular place, that give us reason, or those rituals actually provide us the mechanism through which we then make conservation, through which we then identify conservation areas, whether it is marine conservation, whether it is land, or whether it is waterway conservation. And so those relationships between stories, with rituals, with people, with landscapes and seascapes are as important as the structures that society has created to look after those places. And, while there are sometimes tensions between customary and formal, and there's a lot of discussion in different Pacific Island places about this, there are examples that we can identify in different Pacific places that integrate traditional systems of governance, traditional systems of conservation with the formal systems that we have today. And some of those examples include places like Palau, for instance. So Palau is one of the countries in the Pacific Islands that we know has a huge marine protected area. And Palau's marine protected area is actually framed around the bull, the traditional conservation system that Palauans have. They've taken it and created this bigger entity, but it has the same principle as the bull that traditionally exists in Palau. We see it in other places like the Rahui, in places like Tahiti and the Cook Islands. And so there are examples around the Pacific Islands where people have used traditional system in the governance of environment. Now, the challenge for a lot of us working in the conservation area, particularly non-government organizations, both local as well as international non-government organizations, is to find out or know what already exists in different places so that we work with it, we build upon it, rather than building conservation approach or approaches to environmental protection that is different from what people are already doing. And this is often challenging, particularly for international non-government organizations and other organizations coming in who have particular agendas and particular ideas about conservation, and therefore impose that in Pacific communities that they go to. And so I think the huge challenge, not only for conservation NGOs, but for the rest of us, is figuring out what exists in these different Pacific places and building on it and strengthening it, rather than undermining it by introducing new systems. And I think if we do that, it will encompass customary governance, it will strengthen customary governance, it will strengthen community-based governance, and also it will help integrate the customary and formal systems that we are often trying to grapple with in this space. And this will, of course, as I said, require a deep understanding and a very nuanced understanding of Pacific societies and working closely with our communities. I've gone past my 10 minutes, so I'll stop here and we can have discussions later on. Thank you. Benaka, Benton.
Incredible, Professor. Thank you so much for that and for specifically sharing your insights on your work. And in so many ways, calling each of us to be more aware of our relationship with and responsibility over the natural world and our role in being story keepers and storytellers. I think the last thing I want to say that really blew me away with what you shared is just like the importance of intentionally languaging our stories and histories, as well as remembering our rituals. So thank you very much for that. And obviously we look forward to hearing more during our panel discussion. But before we open up the panel discussion, I want to introduce our final panelist for today. And that is Millicent Barty. Millicent is a Pacific design and communications leader who uses cultural storytelling to support climate resilience. Millicent is the founder of Kastom Keepers. She works with climate-affected communities to protect traditional knowledge and support Indigenous-led climate solution. Millicent's work bridges ancestral wisdom and modern design to drive sustainable change across Melanesia. Super important work, Millicent. Thank you for being here. Look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Thomas Benton. Good fala morning or afternoon, Oketa. I want to first begin by acknowledging our past, present, and future ancestors. And Tagyo Thomas too to the organizers, Transparency International New Zealand, for extending the invitation for this important gathering. Sorlea Baita. Can everyone see my slides all right? Just checking. Okay.
Yep.
So presenting last is always a unique challenge. So many profound truths have already been shared by the powerhouses before me, but I hope that what I can share reinforces and adds on to the conversation meaningfully. As a multidisciplinary designer, I work at the intersection of traditional and contemporary. So in thinking about what I could offer, I kept returning to one thing, and that's weaving. So today I want to share how the philosophy of weaving has shaped both my personal journey and our work at Kastom Keepers in responding to cultural loss, climate justice, and Indigenous governance. You'll hear me refer to Indigenous knowledge systems and traditional heritage simply as Kastom. And in my home, like across much of our region and shared by our previous speakers too, custom and traditional oral histories still guide decisions. Land, sea, and people are not just connected in theory, but we're woven together in principle and daily life. But my story begins with my very first teachers, my elders, especially my grandmothers, who have since passed on to the next world now, but they were keepers of custom and knowledge. I didn't remember much at first, but over time I came to realize just how deeply their teachings were rooted in me. Salt, soil, and spirit. These were our ancestral foundations long before gold, gospel, and glory. I often challenge the idea that, custom or traditional knowledge is lost because we cannot lose what lives on in our blood, what's woven into the land, the sea, and our breath. What we've lost are the opportunities to connect and stay connected. But how do we reclaim that connection when colonization and climate crisis haven't just eroded coastlines, they've eroded our indigeneity, severed the very relationships that once grounded us to place purpose into each other. At the age of 5, my grandmother, Coco in the middle, handed me 3 coconut fronds, 2 old and 1 young, and taught me how to weave for the very first time. As she guided my hands, she said in our Wala dialect, Milina, fausia karan o malniagalna o lalamola gali. Millie, weaving will help you to understand the workings of the universe, and there you'll find your place in it. She was right. Before I ever learned of philosophers like Socrates or Plato, already led me of life. Where do I come from? Why? And where am I going? For me, the answers came through the philosophy of weaving. So much so that at university, I developed Custom Story Time Tool, a weaving methodology and design process that still guides my work today, not through theory alone, although design thinking really helps, but through cultural intelligence shaped by memory, custom, and story. My design work began in communications, creating tools to help our people understand modern systems, from elections and civic rights to land laws and infrastructure projects. I focused on bridging knowledge gaps with low literacy communities, leveraging custom stories, not just for access, but for decision making. But as I was decoding these systems, I began asking, whose knowledge are we translating? Whose systems are we continuously reinforcing? And it became clear the problem wasn't just literacy, it was epistemic inequality, the systematic erasure of Indigenous governance. I wasn't just filling gaps, I was watching our own systems be made invisible and customs clashing with sustainable development. So I pivoted in 2022, I conceptualized, but founded Custom Keepers in 2023, not to preserve tradition behind glass, but to revitalize and respect it as a living system of leadership, law, and resilience within relations. And with 80% of land still under customary tenure here in Solomons, it made sense to center the salt, soil, and spirit system, a worldview where land, sea, air, and people, we are all one living consciousness. And that's the foundation of guardianship. Custom Keepers, we now work with 8 climate vulnerable communities, 6 in Malaita province and 2 in Gizo and Kolombangara. And through our 5 Rs, restore, revive, record, revitalize, and rebuild, we're supporting climate vulnerable communities to safeguard custom systems, learning spaces, and practices that enable sustainability and self-determination. So back to the weaving philosophy, every mat or basket begins with warps. These are the immovable threads, and wefts, the threads that dance in between the warps. For us, our warps are restoring custom learning spaces, strengthening the value and role of keepers of custom and community governance. And through this as well, we've kind of debunked that whole narrative that knowledge holders or custom keepers are just our elders. We've discovered that, majority are women who are memory keepers, and young people as well who possess the gifts of our traditional roles, like the talisbara, which is genealogy mapping. So in return, we also focus on reviving the importance of traditional roles like the geniatha, abefilu, fatabu, just the understanding of how these roles are vital to our customary structures and Indigenous governance. Our wefs is how we dance despite the contemporary challenges we face, climate change, inequality, generational divides, and cultural erosion or the disconnection. And this is where we must and we are most creative. So we co-design our solutions with knowledge holders and community leaders to revitalize practices and record the traditional, ecological, and cultural knowledge, so tech. Not from the outside in, but from inside out. And this is the Indigenous governance. It's adaptive, relational, and future-facing. One of our most success stories that holds it all together is Lilisiana community. In 2 decades, we've lost 23 meters of our shoreline and 3 rows of graves. So this is approximately 200 graves. Several NGOs and government agencies have come to Lilisiana, where the Solomon narrative of climate crisis at the moment, but nothing tangible has happened. In 2023, Custom Keepers, we formed our council of knowledge holders and chiefs to co-design our community-led response to preserve and revitalize our tech. Sorry. So our first step was to restore the Whaiwhai. The Whaiwhai is a traditional custom house, once the center for governance and intergenerational learning. My elders always remind me that custom knowledge is not secret, it's sacred. And sacred knowledge needs infrastructure. Just like religion has churches or schools have classrooms, custom knowledge also needs its own house. So through a series of Altolai, intergenerational learning rituals, we began the process of reclaiming, and our Whaiwhai currently sits on Lilisiana today. And this is just a short video. I'll turn off the sound. But we completed the Whaiwhai in October, but during that time, we were still doing Altolais. By November last year, the community had mobilized to build a seawall with no external funding or engineers. We turned to custom knowledge. Our elders guided the design using land and reef knowledge. Fishermen tracked tidal shifts between Koburu and Ara. So Koburu in traditional knowledge is Koburu and Ara explains the relations between land and sea. So Koburu is said to be the time where the sea feeds the land, and Ara is when the land feeds the sea in return. So with that, our women spoke to our guardians, the sea and spirits, and youth stacked coconut trunks and stones, and we've now reclaimed over 60 meters of coastal land and successfully lobbied to have Lilisiana prioritized under the Cause Climate Resilient Infrastructure Program. And this here is a success story of ours where grassroots governance, and that's deeply rooted in Kastom, raises resilience, self-determination, and most importantly, action from the sea up by the community. I think all in all, this entire 60-meter seawall was about 9,000 Solomon Islands dollar to complete. So Kastom is not folklore. It is living, still living, and it still meets some of our needs for survival. It is how we manage conflict, land, and collective well-being for generations. At Custom Keepers, we aren't romanticizing the past. We are restoring its timeless logic and our ancestral wisdom. Just to reframe Kastom as a resilient governance system that resonates with who we truly are, not in opposition to modern systems of who we've become, but to find meaningful ways to reconcile our relations and stand along one another so we can weave equally as valid and equally sovereign. I think I'm over my 10 minutes, but I just wanted to end with the philosophy of weaving. You know, it teaches us not to pull too hard in one direction, to recognize when the pattern is breaking, and to have courage to reweave. We must protect the systems of meaning that once held these lands and our seas, our relations in balance, our protocols, our stories, our decision-making processes, and corruption and environmental crime or injustices. They continue to fray the very edges of our collective mat, but the Pacific has always known how to repair, how to resist, and how to remember. So if there's anything I leave you with is let us remember that governance is not something we borrowed. Like guardianship, it is something innate that we carry in our looms, in our reefs, our soil, in our stories, and in our hands. And this is the Pacific story that predates the lines on any map. It's time that we not only protect the Pacific, but protect the Pacific way of protecting. And yeah, that's all from me. Tagyo Tomas.
So much in there, Millicent. Thank you so very much for the weaving, the navigating, and the reconciling that you do, and also for articulating so poetically the Indigenous-led advocacy that you're doing, and the power of both reciprocity and intentional cultural storytelling. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for your work.
Tagyo Tomas.
Now that we've heard from each of our panelists, we have about 15 minutes or 20 minutes for a panel talanoa. And what we're really hoping here is to sort of draw on the connections all of the panelists have touched on, from Indigenous knowledge, community leadership, and environmental policy. I have a few questions for our panelists. And then if you have any questions for our panelists, please drop them in the chat as well, and I'll pick them up as we sort of get there. So the first question I have is for you, Professor, and I wanted to hear from you, from your experience, what does successful collaboration between sort of cultural, indigenous, traditional systems and state systems sort of look and feel like?
That's an important question, and I think one that, a lot of people are grappling with. But as I mentioned, one of the values, and Millie and Alisi have also talked about this, that the systems that we had and continue to have, that are often referred to as traditional systems, have been tried for a very long time. Not only tried out in terms of their governance mechanisms, but have been built into the communities that we have. The state, if we think about the state in a lot of Pacific Island places, states are actually guests in our communities. They were introduced and therefore guests in the houses that we have. In this case, our houses are our nation states that we've created. And therefore, as guests in places, states, I think, also have a responsibility to act like guests, which includes finding out what is there, listening to what people have tried out, and figuring out how you collaborate with them. And I think that's what the people from Palau, for instance, have been able to do quite successfully in terms of the bull and the inclusion of the bull in this huge marine protected area. So the idea and the size of the marine protected area that they have is probably new in terms of its geographical coverage. But the ideas that inform it in terms of how you govern it is informed not only by international laws and international experiences, but by very local Palauan ideas of conservation and relationship between people and communities and the resources that they have with them. But that's only one example. There are other examples around the Pacific. And I mentioned the funeral rituals in Fiji, which I'm sure that you, Fenton, and Alisi know very well, some of which have eroded, not died away, but eroded as people move to places like Suva, or they run away to diasporic communities like some of us do, and therefore do not have access to both the space to conserve when somebody dies, but also do not have access to the communities that perform these rituals. But there are places that continue to do that. And I am sure that that's true all over the Pacific as well. I'm not sure that answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. Alisi or Millicent, either of you keen to add any further insight on that? No? Okay, great. Millicent, I have a question for you. From your experience and your work, how would you say we should protect Indigenous knowledge systems from exploitation, protect communities from, I guess, story fatigue, right? Yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Fenton, for the question. And it's a question that we keep at the heart of our work as we navigate the in-between. But I think we start by centering content, context, and custodianship. And it starts with recognizing the value of Indigenous knowledge systems and customary practices, not token inclusion. So Indigenous knowledge, our Indigenous knowledge has long been victimized to extraction. But the way in which we protect it is to acknowledge that it lives in protocols, in stories, in spaces, and in people. And this means empowering our own people and our own stories. And protection means restoring the authority of knowledge holders and respecting the conditions under which knowledge can be shared within its own traditional infrastructures. So at Kastom Keepers, we make it clear that Kastom knowledge is not secret, but sacred. and that sacred knowledge needs its own infrastructure and protection. And it's how we come together in that context in order for it to be protected and effective. Yeah.
Amazing. Alisi or Professor, any sort of insights to add to that on like the protection of Indigenous knowledge from exploitation? Alisi?
Fenton, maybe if I may, and yeah, this is not my area. It just triggered a memory, like these conversations. I remember when I used to work in government, I worked at the Itoke Affairs Board. It's the institutions that set up to govern Indigenous communities in Fiji, for those who are not aware. And one of the things I remember learning early on is about, during the British colonial period, how they were not able to infiltrate, so to speak, the communities and the traditional structures and governance systems. And so one of the things they did was create parallel structures, administrative government structures parallel to our traditional Vanua governance system, so that there could be a sort of communication across, right? Where we have our village and we have our clans and our tribes, and then goes across to have a village council. When it comes up to district level, there is a district council. And so you have like sort of the governance structure that was created. And, you can say that it was influenced by our traditional governance system, the knowledge system that we already have. And then I also remember, to some extent, they did the same thing with the way they set up the structures for our towns and our cities, the governance structure as well, because it was how they were able to govern Indigenous Fijians under the British colony. So in the past, it was used as a tool to control, right? And probably leaning into this sort of decolonization process, we think about how, if you're able to think of our governance structures to be formalized in this way, they're trying to control us. How do we reimagine all of that in a way that, helps us instead of harms us, right? Reimagining these governance structures and systems in a way that recognizes and respects our relationship with environment. And I think it's a big conversation, because it goes into how our legislation was created and how a lot of it gives ownership, power, and recognition to the state. But this is not how it works in our communities, and it's not how we view our relationship. And so how much can we exert this influence over this system that we can change to reflect, our traditional knowledge systems? And I think that could be a way, because ultimately, we can't remove one and bring in another. We have to find a hybrid situation, so to speak, which is a lot of what we do as well in our environmental marine conservation work. So I don't know, not specifically the area I work in, but it sort of triggers these memories of work that we were trying to figure out. And this was like 12 years ago even, and up until now, still trying to navigate that.
Beautiful. Professor, anything come up for you?
Yeah, I was just going to say that is a really valid point, trying to figure out how our traditional structures and systems fit in and inform state structures and systems. But at the same time, I think it's useful to also note that sometimes there is an appropriation of our traditional structures and systems, not purposely to benefit us, but to be used to benefit not only state, but other institutions as well. So it's not only about our governments, but about, big corporations that have become powerful And especially in areas of environment, particularly, in cultural knowledge, as Millie and others have been talking about, I think it's important to be cognizant of this and to ensure that we collaborate rather than be appropriated.
Yeah, reminded of what Millicent shared about this courage to reweave, or in this case, sort of reclaim and reimagine. Thank you for that. I have one more question for you all, but I'm also aware that our audience has questions. So I'm going to hold my question, and if we have time, I'll get to it. But I do want to go to some audience questions for all of you. I have a question from Rita. Does anyone here deal with planned relocation or managed retreat due to sea level rise? Guess that's anyone of you. Millicent has
Not me.
this. Not. Thank you.
Start.
Yeah, go ahead, Alisi.
Planned relocation, not due to sea level rise. This was due to a Category 5 cyclone that caused a river around the village to burst its banks, and it almost wiped out the entire community, 30 plus households and homes. This was in my province in Boa, and so we have a youth network from our province in Boa called the Urban Youth Network. And we have been working with Fiji Council of Social Services on this relocation project in the village that's been relocated, which is a community-led relocation process, the first of its kind in Fiji. All our other relocation efforts prior to this have been government-led in very recent history, but also acknowledging that traditionally relocation has been a part of our way of living. There are countless documentations of communities that have relocated through the centuries. But yeah, that is one project we're currently working on. Yeah.
Thank you. Millicent?
So dealing with the idea of relocation, it's very much prevalent in our work. So we're not just dealing with the logistics, but it's also trying to understand the cultural negotiation and dealing with the anxiety and pain of it all, especially in places like Lilisiana. So families are being forced to, make these impossible decisions, whether to stay and risk their safety, or leave and potentially risk losing their identity. So that's the current question or a reality we're grappling with at the moment with our Lilisiana community. So as a response, we haven't formalized a managed retreat program ourselves, but we're deeply engaged in the community-led adaptation because no one wants to relocate. Hence why we're leveraging our traditional knowledge systems just to guide and safeguard what's left of our land. And where there's also this urgency to document our stories and understand through the Phi-Phi, our elders come together, so women and men, we come together to begin our genealogy mapping. Just acknowledging that as Wala people, we're mostly migrators and we're sea people. So we've begun the process of mapping our genealogy just to identify which other parts of Malaita we've rooted from, and in hopes that, we can carry out traditional reconciliations. But yeah, it is deeply sensitive topic for communities like Lilisiana and the space that we work in. Yeah, I hope that sheds some light.
Thank you, Millicent. I think what comes to mind is like you had mentioned this, right? The sacredness needs infrastructure. And so like this library of stories and this work that you all are doing make a lot of sense. Thank you. A question for the panel. And this is from Paea, and apologies if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. But the question is, has anyone observed distinctions in how Pacific communities in the diaspora relate to the environment compared to those in their ancestral homelands? Yeah. Great question. Professor, you're based in Hawaii. I'm curious if you have a very particular position on this, I reckon.
I guess I fit into that diaspora population, having lived most of my life in Fiji and here in Hawaii. I think there is a huge distinction, and you know, a lot of diaspora community have that affection about environment and about place, but sometimes it's very romanticized because they're divorced from it. They do not live it every day. They do not have the kinds of experiences that Alisi and Millie are talking about. They don't have to build seawalls, and therefore they can have the luxury of talking about it without actually carrying the rocks and building those things. But having said that, I think, you know, we have a lot of young people, and I see it amongst Pacific Islanders here in the US, particularly in California and the Bay Area, who are very committed to issues around, you know, climate change, for instance, that they know are affecting people back home, who are very committed, very passionate about these issues. And as somebody who is much older than a lot of these kids, my task, I think, is not to trust their enthusiasm and their passion, but to help them to know more, and perhaps if they have the opportunity to be able to connect. It's not always easy. It means money. A lot of these kids don't speak the language. You might not believe it, but there are lots of Fijians and Samoans, and there are not lots of Solomon Islanders here, but even my kids don't speak Solomon Island languages. They speak Pidgin, which is a Solomon Island language. And therefore, there are all those layers of complexity that they have to deal with. So I think there is a difference in how we deal with this.
Alisi or Millicent, anything to add?
Very quickly, I agree as well. There is that distinction. And I had that word in my mind as well, the romanticized version and the luxury of being able to care for Vanua in a way that it looks very different for those here living back home. And I think it leads into a conversation around development, around extraction of natural resources. Because when you're living far away and your source of income is, you know, 2, 3, 4 times removed from directly accessing your waters and your forests, it's very easy to speak over. You should say no to this and that. But when you're directly living off the environment, and there are struggles within that, there are, you know, accessibility issues around being able to develop, you know, your livelihoods, your income and access to things. And you want more or better. And an opportunity comes for logging, maybe even sand and gravel extraction, or fishing, or some other activity. And you say yes to it because you see the opportunity in the income that will benefit your family or your community. There is immediate uproar from those who have a say in the customary ownership of the resource, but no longer live within it, or have that sort of diaspora luxury of being saying that because they have other forms of income or livelihoods or things like that. And so it's a very delicate balance. Yeah, we do recognize that. And it's something that we have to grapple with as well, even within the country, like in Fiji. Like our youth network is a network of young professionals who are diaspora within Fiji. We do not live in our villages, but we use our expertise and our professional networks and everything to help the community. And there are times when we think a certain way about how something should be done in the community, very different from how they think it is. And we have to respect and recognize that. And there has to be a balance in the way that's done. So yeah, that's that.
Yeah, thanks, Alisi. I think specifically the last bit that you shared is like highlighting proximity to a particular set of privileges that diaspora folks have and folks at home have, and it's very different. And I think the key is how do we sort of leverage our proximity to different sets of privileges in ways that serve, right? Like you said.
Fenton, if I may quickly add to what Alisi has expressed, which is actually excellent. But just to illustrate that, 2 weeks ago, a relative in Solomon Islands in Guadalcanal, where I come from, messaged me to ask about mining, and I said no. I said, don't enter into any mining agreement, and we had a discussion. But then later on, I was thinking about it, and I thought, I have the luxury of sitting here with a salary the university pays me, and I'm telling somebody from a village for whom $10 is probably a lot of money that you cannot enter into those agreements. And this is just to illustrate what Alisi was talking about, that for people at home, where income is difficult to come by, if somebody comes and offers $1,000 to begin logging or to sign an agreement on logging, it's very easy. And that doesn't mean that they're not concerned about environment, but their choices are much less than what we have living in other places, whether it's in Suva or in New Zealand. And so it makes it really, really difficult.
Naka, Professor Millicent?
Yeah, I mean, what both speakers have shared completely resonates. And I can only speak from personal experience as well. So, I mean, a majority of my childhood upbringing was in Indonesia. And I spent some time studying in the UK before making the decision to move home. So I guess being physically removed or no longer having that physical access to home, there's this experience or this deeply emotional and symbolic experience of connecting through memory, identity, and inherited stories. So for me, that's when I started collecting custom stories every opportunity I got. And now being back home and, spending most of my time in Lillisiana as well, understanding that, the connection or that experience to our environment is not just abstract, as Dr. Tarcisius said, it's immediate, and there's a different experience and a different sense of connection. And to me, what I think is the most powerful is how both these experiences can weave together and complement each other. Diaspora communities often become strong advocates for climate justice globally, while us as at home, we hold and practice the knowledge systems that are rooted in the land. But I believe that's the power of coming together, because we're united by blood, and that's what our land, sea, and air recognizes as our blood. But the power of, coming together to form this woven or braided activism, I think that's a real opportunity that, we should be more intentional about, where cultural continuity and environmental protection are shared, across oceans, because we're grounded by blood, by our abu. That's all I wanted to share.
Thank you, Millicent. True to form, you're bringing back that element of weaving and the importance of it, and weaving the diaspora and the folks at home. So much appreciated. Thank you to everyone that offered forward questions and added to the talanoa and the conversation. I'm going to bring us to a close now. And I was hoping to hear from the panelists one more time, and just offer forward one or two sentences as closing reflections for us, that we could sort of keep at the back of our mind as we go back into the world after this. Should we go by order of our presentation? So Alisi, and then Professor, and then Millicent, please.
Sure. Thank you, Clinton. And I just saw a question I wanted to quickly answer before I get into that. It was from Julie, I think, and she was asking, when young people are working together for change, how do they adapt the use of tech, such as social media, to protect and enhance Indigenous knowledge? This is a very interesting one, and something that we have seen and kind of explored as well, again, within our network, within our province, where we're just making full use of videos. You have live videos that immediately get recorded, or Zoom webinars, especially during COVID. That was when it really became something that we wanted to explore more. How do we utilize this? First, it was like a communication tool because people were isolated. Then we recognized the value of things such as these webinars that can then be saved and then can be accessed later on for people to watch. And so we had a few different types of webinars that we just did for our province, for our people. There were some issues that we had identified that needed to be addressed, and we invited experts in those fields from the province, and it was all done in the dialect. And so these are some of the intentional ways we were engaging with young people, with youth, with people from our communities, to try and use social media, to try and use these tools. And I guess when things opened up and people could access each other in person, it kind of shifted a bit, but it's always been something that we recognize we can always go back to use as one of the ways in which we adapt technology. And I think for my closing remarks, just after responding to that question, is that it's always important to recognize, and because part of my conversation was around youth, but another important thing that we talked about is that intergenerational knowledge. And another thing about our traditional structures of governance is that we have like these general 7 groupings of governance systems that we have. And, they all work together, where you have your chief and the spokesperson, and the mbete, the spiritual leaders, our warrior clans. We have those who are like the architects and builders, and we have like the fisher folks, sort of like our scientists of the ocean and the water. And they all work together. They weave the different, tribes and clans together in the community. But an important thing within all of these different groups is that we have men, women, youth, and children working together. And one of the things that we have kind of found that sort of fractured us a bit is when we're in our national spaces, we find that the call for women's spaces, this call for youth spaces, they try and create spaces for young people, and they're disconnected from each other. And that is against what primarily is how we work in community. And I think we need to find ways to engage in spaces where we're bringing all the generations together, all the different groups, that we're talking to each other more. And while, yes, it is important to have your individual spaces to share and bring out like what are the things that we need to be looking at to focus on, we also need to ensure that we're in community together, intergenerationally, across, all the different identities and all, because we need to be hearing from each other. That's like how our structure works. And that's one of the ways we can continue to revitalize our Indigenous knowledge systems of practice now. That's my final one from me. Thank you so much.
Vinaka, Alisi. Professor?
Yeah, Vinaka, Fenton. I think my final message is to stress the power of stories. The power of stories that inform our institutional structures, that informs our relationship to the environment. Stories of genealogy, stories of rituals, stories of our relationships with each other, as well as our relationship with the world around us. I think those stories, and now that we have the technology to be able to tell those stories, we should capture them and use them to tell stories about our environment, whether it's in the form of short films, in the form of writing, and using the technologies that we have. Because at the end of the day, the truth about stories is that's all we are. We lose our stories and then we cease to exist. Vinaka.
Vinaka. Millicent?
Both very powerful closing words. For me, it would just be to remind us all again about the power of weaving as our Pacific philosophy. Weaving is a practice that's rooted in oneness or wholeness. It teaches us to think beyond ourselves, to see the greater shared good. And once we start thinking from that place, we can truly see what needs to change within the system and find the courage to adjust as new patterns emerge. It's not a linear process, but it's alive, like our ocean and ancestral wisdom. And it's really a forgiving process as well. So especially to our young ancestors and future elders, I want to remind you, all of us, that, you are a sacred thread in this great tapestry we call life. And it's not about fitting your Indigenous identity into foreign frameworks, but it's about finding your place in it, building shared platforms where both systems that govern you stand in balance along each other, because we inherit the patterns that were woven from those before us. And if we remain unconscious, unaware, ignorant, and passive, we will simply repeat the same old pattern. But if you are here, I think it's because you likely feel the call to weave something new, a new pattern. So I urge you all to look to the past for wisdom and to the future for guidance. Let both shape how you live now, so you may be the change that our Pacifica and the world needs. I think I'm no from me, so tagiatumas.
Millicent, Professor Tarcisius, and Alisi, thank you all so much for your work and sharing your wisdom so generously. It's very much appreciated. And I will now hand us back to Julie to bring us to a close.
Oh my goodness. There was so much wisdom and depth there that I've just about have my mouth open for the whole time, just breathing in the knowledge. I'm just so appreciative. The words like braided activism and tell your stories, and they mean so much to me personally as well, being a historian. I just want to thank. I want to thank you for the wonderful ngā nui to our speakers and to our facilitator and to all of those who've spread the word around a webinar series. And thanks to those who asked a question, whātai today, mihi kia koutou. And thank you so much for attending, all of you. There is more coming. There are three more sessions in this series, one on her role, their future, supporting women in Pacific environmental governance. That's on 16th of July. There's one going to be on 6th of August, from the Pacific shores to the Bay of Bengal, about building resilience through governance. And 27th of August, Safeguarding Our Pacific, Tackling Corruption and Protecting Communities. And then we've got another series we'll follow on leadership in the Pacific, women leadership in the Pacific. I think we're just so, I feel it now, it was so right to make sure that we highlighted the voices of about Pacific governance and Indigenous knowledge, because there's a lot of thinking going on in the Pacific and not always a lot of listening. And I think that's a lesson to learn today. I'm going to finish on a poem from Zoe Higgins, who's a Wellington poet, and it's quite quite relevant. It's called To Close a Space. Thanks for everything shared and done, everything said and unsaid, the stumbles, the plunges, the gaps, the leaps. Thank you for this breathing space between us, this space we've woven and tangled from ourselves. Now we let rest. We leave the threads until we pick them up again once more. May we carry the courage to act until we meet again. Ngā mihi nui, haere rā, mā te wā. Thank you.